Alright, so I thought I'd discuss some extra aspects to my previous 1337 video. And these kind of integrate into it pretty neatly, I think, and have some possible predictive power and so on. Um, Nothing of the structure of what I'm talking about actually is different than what some of the deeper right wing figures, the genuinely deeper right wing figures, are saying. But I think I'm explaining the mechanisms by which they operate basically as my addition to it and lining up a pattern of um, decline, collapse, and rebuilding in a way. Um, the Dark Ages and then the Feudal Ages and so on, and the collapse of Rome that precedes it. So, as per my previous video, I mentioned the aged out women that were loose but non committed to alpha males over one night stands would get aged out of relationships. But that's actually not quite true. What will happen is they'll lower their standards as they're desperate, and they'll begin to mate with lower standards of men who've matured and grown in capacity. Now, this has an effect where it might age out the woman in terms of having children or make it more difficult to have children so you can have less children. But it is what it is. So let's say 20 to 40, the bottom 40 to 20% of men will have access to women who are sort of slightly reproductively capable. Once they're older and lower their standards. And don't get me wrong, this happens for the top 40 to 80% of level of men as well. In the hypergamous society. But to simplify it, the easiest way to look at it is the bottom 20% of men get with the bottom 20% of women in older age in monogamy, because they decide through experiences that it's not a happy feeling to be tossed aside, and they want a consistent relationship. So the return to monogamy is actually reinforced on every level in this decision. Now the question is, what happens with the younger cohorts, the next generation, when the current generation poaches a bunch of their women? Well, basically, what happens is they get more aggressive and they organize along the lines of in-group loyalty versus out-group. Now, in a very loose sense, I don't think Trumpism is Nazism literally or anything like that, but in a very loose meta sense, the processes I described just now explain Trumpism and Nazism at the same time as different variations of the same general trend in cycles of history. And these have happened multiple times before Nazism, before Trumpism, and so on, to varying levels of intensity. And one of the differences between Trumpism and Nazism is Nazism was an all or nothing, try and take over the world, fight everyone at once, and like genocide them. And Trumpism is a minimum intervention, maximal gain per intervention, zero-sum strategy that accepts other people can exist. And that's a very big difference. So Trumpism is trying to be the big man on the block, where Nazism is trying to be the only man on the block. Big difference. But I will give heed to the leftists childishly, in a sense, noticing certain similarities in the direction, in a sense. Now, what this means is that there's going to be a purification of the alphas and elites of an in-group to be more consistent with the lower ranks of their in-group. And the reason Nazism and the Soviet Union are so bad is they... actually, no, there's another aspect to this that explains the dynamics when you combine it, which is we're moving from the elites being predatory within the country on their own people to elites being predatory on other countries for their own country's people. People are afraid of the meaning of that because it's more powerful and so on, and so on. But it's a more measured approach because, technically speaking, over the years, we actually have, in fact, increased the genetic diversity of our countries, and even the populist people that I mentioned, like Trumpism and so on, in its similarity to Nazism in a very loose and meta sense, recognize this fact. So it's a very definite distinction between Trumpism and Nazism, even if they're part of the tail end of this hypergamy, monogamy, alpha versus beta male cycle of evolutionary events and so on that I mentioned in my previous video and so on. Now, there's another aspect to this, which is men are consistently more homosexual, or consistently have a higher homosexuality rate than women. Women are more typically Grok gave the example that 4 to 6% of men are homosexual exclusively, but like 1.5 to 4% of women are exclusively lesbian, whereas 1.5 to 10% of women are bisexual. So there's a variability in women's preferences based on the situation and so on, and this is important for describing the glue that holds society together and the whole framing of all women are bisexual. This also relates to certain relationships between women when there's one man and multiple women as wife and concubines and so on, for sexuality, for group union and so on, so that the women aren't constantly tearing each other's throats. Because if you know who's your kid, then you're much more intensely likely to really hate other people's kids competing with your resources. So the bisexuality companionship element of women actually is kind of a glue in terms of harems and stuff like that a little bit, which is an evolutionary aspect to humanity technically. But what this means is, also there's one more aspect to this, which is women start off a little more bisexual often than they are when they're older. And if this plays out, then there's going to be a certain women grow less bisexual the older they get, on average. Because the men are more and more competent because they actually survive long enough to grow and develop their character and skills and so on to be attractive at a critical threshold for the woman to switch to a monogamous relationship with a man when they're in loose, what's it called, friend relationships, situationships with men and women, from women. Now what this means is there's going to be a purification of elites to be more alpha focused on behalf of the middle ground males, the mid-tier males, as a proper in-group. And to focus on competing against out-groups of other nations and ethnicities and races and so on. And countries, specifically. So, you will notice that there's a move from predatory elites within the country to elites that are alphas on behalf of the people of their country to be predatory on other countries. So there's a re-expansion of the franchise within the country itself, in some ways. Now, Nazism was against homosexuals, and Bolshevism was against class enemies of the proletariat. So these are failures of this process. Those go against the logic of what I just said. The Night of Long Knives was the SA being backstabbed literally by the SS, and the anti-Kulak Bolshevism, collectivization of farms, and starvation of Ukraine in Holodomor for the productive, wealthy farmers, is examples of being so in-group that you're keeping the elements of the predatory elites as an in-group of elites out, and the out-group is actually including your own countrymen. To back up the reason why anti-homosexuality to the point of genocide, well, not genocide to homosexuals because they're not like literally killed off as a genetic output. But let's just shorthand it with saying genocide of homosexuals is the gay uncle approach is valid, but it also includes low-quality males who survive long enough to gain wisdom despite their weakness. And what that means is there's worker drones, kind of like worker bees that don't actually mate with the queen bee or ant to carry on the reproduction aspect, but they do the resource gathering aspect and the protection of the colony through fighting aspect. So the unfit combinations of genetics are sacrificed reproductively. But if you noticed, I said the low-quality men get with the low-quality woman at a later age. So there's an experience of companionship as a re-up to maintain the happiness of people and a redemption of sorts in personal life. And the reproductive advantage is you have people not competing for resources on the reproductive level, but they're contributing to the resources of those who do reproduce, who often share their genetics. So they can lose their lives with minimal consequences for the group as a whole. And Nazism is an expression of deliberately exterminating those outgroups that provide those resources, while also trying to take on the entire world. So it's a calibration issue in terms of its raw morality and so on. Trumpism is not Nazism, Trumpism is not Bolshevism, but it is also, at the same time, similar in one sense, that it's an expression of this cycle's tail end into the return to building up after a collapse of values and so on. And the other two, Bolshevism and Nazism, are failed versions that bring upon an increased dark age after an initial burst of growth and so on. They burn the midnight oil to the point that they run out halfway through the night, where Trumpism is going to last the distance. And it's like a raging bonfire versus a candle to light the pages of your book you're reading. You know. And remember, it's minimalist, so it's not actually the most harmful version. It's the least harmful version to the rest of the world, while being maximally effective in boosting your own people's well-being. And that's important because that's actually quite a natural state in a semi-cooperative but also competitive environment with other distinct groups and ethnicities and races and genetics of other people. And that's roughly represented by civilizations. So you're not trying to exterminate everyone else, you're trying to be the big man on the block with the most resources. People might object to it, but that's the inevitable explosion of being denied your birthright. So fuck those people that complain about it in a way, because they made it to this point. They made things to the point that this would inevitably happen. Yeah. Now, what this means is basically we're not seeing the rise of Nazism, and I think nuclear weapons has a part to play in that, in preventing direct warfare between strong powers. But we're seeing kind of proxy wars. But you notice that Russia-Ukraine is different from America-Iran or America-Venezuela, and that represents okay, I'm gonna say something here that's kind of, I don't want it to be misconstrued because I don't mean it quite literally. But if Putin were closer in the Nazi direction, Trump is a little bit further from the Nazi direction in terms of its proxy empire policies. And what we're seeing is a genuine return to neo-feudalism as a normal practice, where the nobles represent noble qualities compared to the peasants, but also are for the peasants' well-being to some extent. More so than before, when they were just exploiting the peasants. Because a house divided cannot stand. And the internal logic of the elites predating on the middle of the road people who form the majority of the population, and cooperating with the other elites of the other rest of the world, won't stand, so you have to cooperate with your own middle people, and even the lower people to some extent, of your own group against the outer group. Or outer groups. This also matches why homosexuality is consistently higher over time in someone's life in men than women, because there are also more men than women born every year. So in times of peace and prosperity, when people don't die off as much as men, you have to find companionship somehow. So it's okay, you find companionship with another man or something. Yeah, yeah. So there's a kind of push and pull in the Mother Nature is a cruel mistress, but God ordains that the world functions to the benefit of mankind kind of way. A push and pull sort of situation going on with these things. It's not all one way or all the other, but you can see how it kind of interlinks and so on. Now, what I'm going to mention is going to be rather specific, but I think people are going to begin to balance the budget, whether by cutting spending or growing the economy more and more often, as they focus on the in-group's well-being, their own country, over other countries, the out-group. And eventually, my guess is, based on the fact that in medieval times, when the monarchs owed the Jews money and the Jews passed the monarch paying them, the monarch would throw the Jews out. When you combine what I just said about how they're going to cut the debt, the deficit, and grow the economy into prosperity, they're going to get to a point where they can roughly balance the budget, and they're going to start passing laws that limit the interest rates they have to pay on their debt. And if someone complains, they can make an example out of them where the person gets nothing. And this is a divide and conquer strategy in a sense, where you're renegotiating the terms of the interest rates in the nation in debt's favor, because so many nations are in debt to random people, basically, or nobody even, somehow, magically, that the first people to do it are going to inspire the rest to do it in some way too, which means that the lenders won't be able to play everyone against the individual country that does it in the first place, which is to renegotiate the interest rates in the favor slightly of the country that owes the money, to also further limit the payments required to get even with the debt, basically. Another version of this is if there were a Western-wide reason for, say, Canada nationalizing the resource rights of China, theoretically it's possible that China would just be screwed and Canada could negotiate selling the resources as nationalized to Europe and so on, and the USA for a better profit. And this is how to get out of a slump strategically, tactically, from owing people too much money to the point you're about to go into a sovereign debt crisis. You can argue it's unfair, you can argue it's ugly, and so on, but what's uglier is a sovereign debt crisis where the people of a country starve to death because they can't pay their interest rates because they accrued so much debt because of the lefty socialists. Yeah, so that's what it's going to come down to. That is the strategic and tactically sound ways that we can get out of the dark ages into developing and rebuilding into a better golden age than before. I think it's inevitable. I'm just predicting this outcome and why it exists and so on. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, roughly speaking. And, if you're complaining about taking out Venezuela and Iran, just remember Venezuela is tied to China and Iran's tied to Russia. And China and Russia are the great powers that are antagonistic to Europe and the USA. And you'll note this doesn't mean a race for Africa in terms of colonization. I don't know how to assess Africa in any wise way that other people haven't, so I'll refrain from doing so. But you might be able to get some knock-on effects of my principles of how this will operate in regards to how people treat Africa and so on. I will say the cutting of free money to Africa is part of that cut in the budget to balance the books that I mentioned. And also that a country that earns money is more secure than a country that relies on welfare from other countries. And also has a system that rewards hard work instead of parasites, which is always better for the country as a whole, because the more people generating, the more wealth and products and physical things and services, well, not services, products, then the more things people have in general, and the services kind of, I don't want to say they leech, but they sort of like facilitate and grease the wheels of spreading stuff around. So they're reliant on manufacturing and resource gathering, or resource gathering then manufacturing, to be functional in the service industry. And that's known as primary, secondary, and tertiary industry. So it aligns with basic economic principles. Anyways, that's all I got for now, but I hope you understand, and I hope you appreciated this analysis, and yeah. So I've explained why the left sees Nazism in Trump without Trump being actually a Nazi, basically. But I understand that on a very meta level, that sort of generalizes the situation more and more and more that we're in. There is a rough correlation in some ways that is real. But the specific aspects of the system of Trumpism versus Nazism or Bolshevism are actually fairly strongly different at the core. So it's not Nazism. This is the difference between a high-resolution take and a low-resolution take on a situation. And that's one of the, and I hope I've resolved the reasoning behind why the left sees Trump as Nazism and the right sees Trump as return to golden age and so on, and why there's a difference, because it's got a similarity in a meta sense on both aspects. And this is as far as I can tell, an inevitable process that Trump's just the spokesman of, basically. And they can fight it, but the right's going to win in the end anyways, because it has to, for our continued survival. While appreciating the left has a place in analyzing things and has sometimes stumbled across some sort of limited form of wisdom, at least sometimes, and how it relates and how it differs and so on. So yeah.